Welcome to another episode of Just More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justmorefix.com or on Twitter at justmorefix. If you like us, you can support us at Patreon, and you should give us a rating and a review at iTunes or wherever you find us at. In this episode, we're going to talk about improving your fantasy gaming. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
I'm Jason.
I'm Adam.
And I'm usually Dave from the Digital Soup Podcast.
A proud member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to now.
The opinions expressed are those of each individual. Check out all the other podcasts
At GonnaGeek.com and get ready because geekiness begins in 3,
2,
1.
Welcome to Just More Fix. Couple quick announcements before we get things rolling today. First off, we'll be hosting another Indie RPGs Day at Game in Terre Haute on October 20th from 1 to 5. So if you're in the Terre Haute area and you want to come try out some games with us, come check us out. That's at Game on South 7th Street on October 20th from 1 to 5. Couple cool things in the pipeline here coming up soon. First off, we do have an interview that we're recording, not tomorrow, it is Sunday. So very soon we should have another interview coming up, and it looks like we're going to try and schedule those out to about where we have about one interview a month, I believe. We might miss a month here and there, depends on how scheduling goes and stuff, with some other game designers and people that work in the gaming industry. And so HillCon is coming up for us, which will be October 12th, 13th, and 14th. And for those of you that don't know, we have our own little mini convention that we have here at our house. We call it HillCon because we live on top of a giant hill in the middle of nowhere. And it's just a time for us to take some time out once a year to get all of our friends together and come to our house, which is awesome, and hang out for a weekend and just cram as much absolute gaming in as we possibly can.
And as a bonus this year, there's going to be caramel apple, fireball, whiskey, apples.
Right on, so we'll see how those go.
Fireball, whiskey, caramel apples?
Something
I guess that
like
makes more sense.
Right. But the only reason why I mentioned it is because it's a tradition that we have started several years ago now. I think this is the third HillCon. And the only reason why I mentioned it is because I think there's so much going on and everybody talks about how they don't have time for gaming and life and work and all that kind of stuff. But I do really believe that if you set aside one specific weekend a year with friends that you have that don't live so close, and if you have a place where you guys can all get together, whether it's somebody's house or some other location, and just make time and make it a priority to get everybody together and have a ton of games and a ton of fun, because we see everybody at Gen Con, but Gen Con is so big and it's sort of its own monster that you never get as much gaming in as you want, I feel like, at Gen Con.
Yeah. That's why I like the smaller conventions.
Yeah, there's a little more focus on just gaming and not so much
gaming, because there's less other stuff and less space between. And
yeah, not that the other stuff is bad, it's just...
No, it's great. I'm glad it's only once a year, though. Really, every 2 years might be better for my budget. But...
So I don't know that there's any real point to it, but just to say that if you guys, for any of you out there that are struggle to find time to get your gaming group together and old friends together and stuff, just pick a weekend and put it on the calendar, several months in advance, and everybody usually has time to sort of work around it and make time and get everybody together and have some great time, some great games and great drinks and awesomeness.
If you guys are hanging out on Kickstarter, the Things from the Flood, the next book in the Tales from the Loop gaming saga universe, anyways, is on Kickstarter now.
Yeah, it looked very cool. 90s, and it looks like you can die.
From Free Illigan.
So,
well, you kind of like age, right? You're teenagers in this one instead of...
Yeah, so the risk is a little higher, it says. Because it says
pre-adolescence?
Because it says in there that you can die. So I was kind of intrigued by it, so... Right on.
Intrigued by death.
Well, just a tone change, really, is
right,
what I
right.
was more intrigued by. But...
I got it. It's set in the 90s, too, instead of the 80s.
All right, so I don't think we have any other announcements for right now, but we're kind of going to lay this episode out here. And this is just sort of the intro to what we're going to do. This is going to be sort of a 5 or 6 part series where we realize we've sort of talked a whole lot about horror and have completely neglected fantasy in big ways, because we sort of talk about incorporating horror into your fantasy and all this other stuff to improve it, but we never really ever talked about specifically fantasy gaming. So we're going to take 5 or 6 episodes here, maybe not all straight in a row. We're going to do this series, and it will all specifically be for fantasy gaming and ways to improve your fantasy gaming. And more specifically, the ways that we have reinvigorated our table for fantasy gaming, because it just sort of withered and died after a time. And now, because of certain products and certain things and inspiration, it's sort of experiencing a resurgence right now. Right?
It's a phase.
A phase.
We're going through. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what makes it fantasy. What are the tropes present in fantasy? And so even though not all of the tropes have to be present in order for it to count as fantasy, you pretty much have to hit a good 2 or 3 of them for it to really count. And if you add technology, then you've jumped the shark. You jumped the shark. You're now science fiction. Except steampunk. That's kind of a weird thing, right?
It's kind of a blend of the two. Well, it's almost its own thing, I think, because it has some technology, but not really.
But it's like what we consider historical technology.
Yeah, it's like messy technology. You know?
I don't know.
Sometimes it works. It's unreliable.
Powered.
Yeah. Well, also, I think with that technology, it's almost more fantastical, because in sci-fi stuff, you can look at the technology like, oh, yeah, computerized and, microchips and lasers and whatever. But
I think there's a certain amount of technology, but whether or not you actually understand how to manipulate it and use it. So if it's technology, but your understanding of it is so slight that it's actually more like magic, well, then you know what I mean? There's this gray area there. Maybe. That's how you get all the post-apocalyptic kind of fantasy setting. It's not really necessarily sci-fi, because Gunslinger.
Oh, right.
Right. So they have all this technology from before, but nobody knows what it does, or, nobody can fix it.
Well, I was just thinking specifically for steampunk, I think it's not the technology is so not really plausible. There's no steamships running around, with a giant boiler and a, come on. So it's almost sure, there's technology, but it's so ridiculous that it's fantastical,
It's your great-great-grandfather's science fiction novel.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Steam engines, where do we go from here?
Or whatever. Yeah. Yes.
It definitely has a very mad scientist-y vibe, though. Anyway, kind of got a little track there.
So to start this off, we sort of narrowed things down and kind of distilled things down to their essence, because that's where I think how you sort of get to the bottom of this and how to really focus things to improve them and sort of turn them around and revitalize some things. So we realized that there are a whole lot more pieces to fantasy than what we're going to sort of talk about, but these are the things that we have honed in on and narrowed down to sort of really make our table shine, right? So do you want to go ahead and start off then?
Okay, so probably the most glaringly obvious trope in the fantasy setting is good versus evil. And we've kind of bantered a little bit about how we don't like just the flat good versus evil kind of characters. However, I'm going to interject and broaden your mind here for a moment, because a couple of things. First of all, good versus evil can mean a couple of different things. One being, I'm the good guy, you're the bad guy, good versus evil, right? Mm-hmm. The other one can be a war of good versus evil that's going on within the individual. So you see that when you talk about whatever, the hero's journey that we went back to, where it was kind of here's the thing, no, I don't want to do the thing, and then whether or not you refuse the destiny and become Darth Vader versus whether or not you follow through and then become Luke and then sort of also become Darth Vader later, or at least cranky old man hermit. I don't know. It's a weird progression to the Force. But anyway, so you can also have the internal struggle of good versus evil, which is just sort of part of character development in general. I would also like to say we talk about, when we're discussing horror gaming, about how it's good to have light beats mixed in with all of your darkness and oppression. I feel like the same is true in games. So when you look at, let's say, Lord of the Rings, right? Or so you have Gandalf, right? Who seems to be pretty clearly on team good. Okay. Or, the Hobbits, they're always pretty good. Frodo, he has some moments with the ring, but that's again, his internal struggle.
Right.
Combined with his fight against Sauron. Mm-hmm. Sauron and Saruman. I get them mixed up sometimes. It's Sauron, right? But you also have Sauron, very clearly evil, You have the Uruk-hai, very clearly evil. But then you also have some minor characters who sort of like are on that fence, right? So you have the King of Rohan, for example. So he's being manipulated by this guy who is not necessarily evil.
He worked for Saruman.
He did. Yeah, he did work for Saruman. But is he really evil, or is he just like playing the sides?
No,
You know what I mean?
I think he was actually evil.
But he's clearly not as evil as Sauron.
Well, no, but I don't think that.
No, but this is important because when it comes to people like that, there's a question of whether or not they can be brought back from this brink of badness. There's no question with Uruk-hai. There's no question with Sauron. Like, he is solidly team evil. And then there's the King of Rohan himself. And then you think, oh, he's going to be on our side, right? He's a good guy. But then he's like, no, screw you, Gondor. You weren't there for me. Doing like the selfish man thing, right? So then you're like, well, is he really good? And the Boromir goes back and forth. So I think there's a lot of what I'm getting at here. There's a lot of gray characters mixed in with that. But it's also refreshing to have purely evil characters that, you know, no matter what, I can rally against this thing. This is solidly team bad, and I can fight that thing. And that makes it just, I don't know, it's the refreshing thing I find about fantasy, in that there isn't as much gray sometimes. I no matter what else happens, no matter what happens to my character, I know, like, this guy's bad.
Well, I feel like also the people that aren't as bad are more like complications along the road to defeating the big bad. So,
Well, you can kind of see the same
Lord of the
thing with Harry Potter, too, right? Like, Lord Voldemort,
bad guy.
always going to be bad. Draco Malfoy, maybe there's a chance for him. Maybe we can pull him back from where he's at. Beatrix Lestrange, definitely team bad. And then you have Snape, and who's kind of back and forth throughout the whole thing, and you're never really sure where he's coming down on things. And I think it's important to have both those types of characters in the fantasy thing, because one makes it fantasy and one makes it interesting. And if you don't have both, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, if all of your characters are gray, you're just playing the game of real life. If none of your characters are evil, then you're not really doing a fantasy thing.
Well, I also think it might be important to draw a distinction between good and evil and selfish. Because if you looked at Game of Thrones as an example, right, there are lots of characters in there who I don't think I would classify as necessarily
that was on my list
evil.
too. But the whites,
Yeah.
evil.
Right. But so you have all this whole laundry list of characters you can go through, who, the Hound being a great example, right? He's not exactly evil. He's definitely not good either, but he is selfish.
Well, none of the humans are really
There's a few that I think you could say, like John.
is evil.
No, is good.
How dare you, sir?
No, I thought you meant good. There's a couple. I think there's very few that are like shining examples of good or evil on the.
Joffrey's pretty solidly team evil
Yeah.
in the sociopathic
I think he's
sense.
team evil, but like not in a world domination mastermind way. Sort of
No.
like in a maniacal serial killer who's going to go off like a bottle rocket and then die.
He's a sociopath.
Right. So, but I think that maybe one of the keys there, I think, is to draw the distinction between good and evil is a super important thing to have, but also to have the characters that are going to, other characters that are there to sort of, like you said, be the upbeats between your bad guys, your true evil, your pure evil, but they can still have some color to their character and some nuance in that they're selfish, not that they're working for Saruman. They're just selfish and looking out for
Even if they are working for Saruman, that's what I'm saying, is those characters are not considered beyond redemption. The only people that are considered beyond redemption are the people that are evil, 100% evil. Like Sauron, there is no redemption for Sauron. Saruman, maybe there was a chance at one point. Like, and that's how you get that final battle. And then you're like, okay, no, I guess he's not coming back,
Right.
you know? But up until that point, there's a chance, like maybe Gandalf will win him back over.
I suppose it's possible, I think, but I like the idea of sort of having the idea of selfishness being in alignment, for lack of a better word, right?
Yeah,
In that
but it's not evil.
Right. Yeah. That's what I'm saying, is that you need to draw a distinction between actual evil like working against humanity and against life, or however you want to say that, and then just self-preservation and I want to make an extra buck, or I don't want to risk my own life, or whatever that is. Mm-hmm. Right on. All right, so along with the good versus evil thing, it ties directly into the delivery of a quest. And this is something that sort of makes me crazy because it's sort of not done well at the table a lot of times. But all of these stories that we enjoy and we love so much all involve some kind of quest. I don't have problems with quests. I have problems with how you sort of get on the path. A lot of times it just seems so artificial and terrible. But if you look at any of these different pieces of media that we enjoy, whether it's Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or any of these, there's all some giant quest that the characters are on. And I almost feel like that's part of there is a quest, but the quest isn't something small and simple. The quest is larger than life. So it might be you're just a farm boy who's the chosen one who has to go save the world. Now, there's no way that you're capable of doing that, but that's the journey to get there is where you gain all this experience. By the time that you come to the final battle with whatever the great evil is, that you've gained this experience, right?
Mm-hmm. I think the quest, though, I mean, I know it's kind of lame, but it sort of resonates with with life because like what would it really take? Like, think about yourself right now in your life. What would have to happen for you to leave your comfortable life? What do you care about enough? And what kind of challenge would you be willing to face to leave your house and your comfortable life to go do this thing?
So I agree with what you're saying there. My problem comes down to when it's at the application of the table of the old boring thing of you go to the inn and there's the creepy guy in the corner staring at the fire as it burns who's going to deliver some quest to you. That's what I have a problem with. I would rather have something that you get into a little more organically, or you've built it into your backstories of the group of your characters, sort of like in a Fate style where you create the aspects with each other. Mm-hmm. I would much prefer that than the first start of most D&D style games where you make your first level characters and then you meet up at the inn and there's some job to be done escorting the wagons or whatever. And it just seems sort of ridiculous because we all know it is. At the same time I say that, I'm going to 100% contradict myself now. As we sit here and talk about that, and if we talk about planning a game, I don't like it. Okay. At the same time, when it comes down to the actual moment where we're playing the game, if that's what we have to do to get on the path, then that's fine. I would rather do that and then just get on the path and forget about it and get moving towards whatever it is we're supposed to do, as opposed to go through some giant sort of...
Just have the old guy in the bar be like the red herring and he sends you on a wild goose chase where you walk down the path to the next city and absolutely nothing happens, but while you're gone, goblins terrorize the city you left and like, you know, the wizard comes and blows things up. Like, no, I should have been there the whole time.
So I don't know, I feel funny about it because it's just, we all know there's no mystery to it, and I feel like, and I think I'm going to come back to that a lot throughout all of these episodes, is that when you walk into the inn, it's like, okay, where's the guy that's going to give us the quest now? You know, and that's boring. It's tired, you know, and it's frustrating to me, but it's a huge part of it. And if you don't have the quest, right, then you almost don't have a fantasy game. If Conan can't go chase down Khazad-dûm, there's no movie, there's no story, you know? So I totally admit that they need to be there. It's just the initial getting started on it, I find to be a little bit of a speed bump to get over. But yeah, I don't know. I guess one example is I thought about the 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas, and the sort of way he kind of falls into that is a little more interesting than you find. Like, he goes and he gets caught, gets caught sleeping with the Sultan's wife or something, right? Because he's sort of like the Sultan's wife's lover or something, and it gets caught up in it, and he's exiled, and that's how he sort of finds himself in the company of these Vikings, and then sort of stumbles into the quest from that, right? It's not delivered by some weirdo in the corner. It's sort of the consequence of his character's background, right? And
this is like the exact same story as King Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot.
Well,
I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, no, it's, well, and we're going to talk about King Arthur a fair amount and throughout this, but and that is a big part of it. But if everybody knows the King Arthur story, right? But unless you really are paying attention and trying to find those sort of moments and tropes in the 13th Warrior, you might not even realize it or notice it. And that's where I think those are the examples to pull from, where it sort of hides that stuff enough to where there's enough compelling pieces to it to where you don't realize what's actually happening, right?
I think revenge is its own powerful quest motivator.
Well, yeah. And that's another thing.
It's almost the easiest one to pull off that isn't you meet at an inn.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then having generally speaking, when you sit down and you're playing one of these games, you have 2, 3, 4, 5 players, right? Now we're all on the same quest, but isn't it much more interesting if we're all on the same quest for different reasons? So maybe my reason is prophecy, and maybe Lacey's reason is revenge, right? And Kurt's reason might be loyalty, right? Because if you look at the Fellowship of the Ring, Sam is there because of loyalty to Frodo. Mm-hmm. Frodo is there because he's the chosen one. Everybody is there for sort of different reasons. And
Frodo was there. Is like, fine, I'm just tired of you guys arguing.
Right, yeah.
I'll do the job, whatever.
But that's sort of what makes that whole group more compelling, and that's really
Frodo in the Fellowship. Please just stop arguing. I'll just do it if it means we don't have to do this anymore.
But that's what makes that story more interesting, is that not everyone is there for super altruistic reasons. It sort of ends up being that way, right?
No, really, like Sam and Frodo and Gandalf are the only people there for altruistic reasons.
Right. So like Aragorn is there. He's like has this unresolved thing in him because he's supposed to be the king, but he can't. I don't know. It's just interesting. That's what makes it interesting.
It's a sense of obligation.
Mm-hmm. That's all I'm really getting at, is that there are more reasons to be on the quest than just, well, this guy asked us to go do it, right? And maybe everyone doesn't need to know that if they're on the table. Maybe that's sort of worked out in back histories and whatever, and it can come out through gameplay. But it's just a more compelling story that way.
Mm-hmm. The shared trauma one is kind of an interesting thing too. Like you see that in Harry Potter.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like with him and like Neville have both lost parents to the dark side, as it were. You know, another common trope in fantasy is different fantastical races, like centaurs,
right?
Or what's another sentient?
Elves and dwarves.
Elves, dwarves. That's not fantastical. Goblins. All of the other sentient races that you can think of.
Well, essentially, they're
different kinds
mythical
of
beings.
Yeah, creatures. So yeah, I don't really have a whole lot more to say about that. I feel like everybody's pretty familiar with the idea of different creatures that are intelligent.
Well, it's kind of funny too, because it makes this weird thing happen where, in a lot of ways, you have the elves who hate the dwarves, and there's this large group of humans in the middle, and they're sort of broken up into a couple sections. Like these ones are sort of like Robin Hood, and these ones are the knightly goodly people, and these ones are the wicked bad ones. And I don't know, it just sort of gets boring.
This isn't one that's like necessarily present in all of the fantasy things, but you do see it in some other like in not necessarily races, but you do see like the fantasy creatures in general in some of the other stories, like in the pirate stories, right? You have like the Kraken or
like monsters.
I never say it right, but like Charybdis, the teeth in the whirlpool in the ocean. Charybdis.
I don't know. Yeah, close enough.
I don't speak Greek.
But it's you think of Game of Thrones, and they have dragons in there, and they have some of the people, and the whites and the White Walkers. All right, so going along with some of these mythical creatures, I think kind of segues directly into magic. And almost every fantasy world has some kind of magic, whether it's big, huge, crazy magic or small, minor things, more like a Game of Thrones style, like where there's also magic sort of growing in that world. But all of them at some level have it. And I think some of them do it better than others. I think if you want to look at magic, I think really Lord of the Rings is a terrible example of it, because all the magic that Gandalf uses is really kind of unimpressive. You know, the "you shall not pass" moment, which is this really cool moment in the film, and cool and dramatic, but he just cracks a bridge. That's all he does. And there's a lot of light stuff, like he cracks the rock and it turns the trolls to stone in The Hobbit, and they charge down the hill and the sun comes up and it blinds the orcs. And I'm like, this is really kind of...
It was like a wizard battle between him and Saruman in the tower.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And they kind of throw each other around.
They have a duel.
But I felt like it was sort of looked like a bad day at the nursing home to me. It just was, I don't know. I just wanted more out of a wizard duel. Like now, when I think of cool wizard duels, I think of like Doctor Strange. With the mirror dimension, and they're running around, and the cool runic symbols that are spinning and all this craziness, like that's way awesome and cool looking, right? That's what a wizard duel should look like. Or some of the ones from Harry Potter where they're like flipping wands and shooting fire and knocking it away. Like those are cool and exciting. Maybe not quite as flashy as Doctor Strange, although there's special effects limits or whatever with technology, I guess. It's a fair point. But those are big moments of magic that are sort of larger than life and show you how much possibility there is in the world with magic. And at the same time, magic can sort of overcomplicate things too, because if there's so much magic, it's sort of like, why are we having these mundane problems when we can just sort of solve everything with magic? Sort of like...
But you can never solve everything with magic or you break the world. Like even in Harry Potter, like it's like, okay, well, how come you can fix the glasses but not my vision?
I agree.
Like you can't fix everything.
Those are a little more...
I can grow bones back, but I still am nearsighted.
Yeah, I don't understand why my eyeballs aren't fixed yet. But that's also sort of like to make the character have some kind of weakness or limitation, But in some of the older fantasy literature and stuff, like with Forgotten Realms and stuff, their magic almost is boundless. And I'm kind of like, why does anybody die in this world? Because you can raise them from, like, literally raise them from the dead. So why is there any suffering in the world or badness in the world when you can just bring people back to life? It's not a big deal. Like the gods are real. They walk around.
Like everybody can do that.
Well, no, but I think there's a temple in most of the larger cities. It's just, I don't know. It's sort of at that level where magic is that common. I think it starts to present some more problems in the world, and then it's not as interesting. It sort of magic becomes mundane at that point because it's everywhere. So I think it's really cool to use, but there are some of the classic fantasy worlds that we're used to where it is too much. Does it make sense?
What about Discworld?
Well, Discworld is a special case because it's one part fantasy, right? And then one part satire. So sometimes the magic is just there as sort of a literary device to to make the satire more ridiculous. And there are definitely fantasy tropes, and it's definitely fantasy in Discworld, but I feel like because what it is, it sort of almost becomes its own thing. I don't know that we should make that exception, but I'm going to. So, because it does meet all the qualifications for fantasy, but it does Discworld, and Terry Pratchett does a great job of taking...
I don't think there's actually any good versus evil in Discworld.
Not like a pure evil in the sense of like Saruman. I don't think so. I mean, there's death, but he's not really evil. He's doing a job.
It significantly changes the feel from like what you consider classic fantasy.
I guess you're right about that. I never really
different.
considered that. Because it doesn't have the same sort of gravitas of the end of the world coming in those stories that it does. Even, I guess in some of them there is the end of the world coming, but I guess I never really considered Discworld because it's sort of like sits in my brain. It sits in its own bucket because it's just, well, it's Discworld. And that's not a knock on it because it's great and it's awesome, but it definitely does sort of sit in its own little container, I guess. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the last one of this is medievalism. And for whatever reason, we sort of have this obsession with like European Dark Ages, all the way up to like early Renaissance stuff or whatever. And that almost fits into every fantasy world. And they may fit in a different part of the Middle Ages where it's a little bit more, early period. But they all fit in this broad category of armor and swords and knights and barbarians and whatever.
Yet I suddenly have the need to play in a game that's Lord of the Rings, but in the Amazon.
And jungle everywhere.
Giant half man, half mosquito.
So this ties in a lot to King Arthur, which Lacey already mentioned. And there's a lot of ties to King Arthur and the Arthurian legends and all that stuff throughout all of fantasy stuff. And I think a lot of the properties that have come later are inspired by that and sort of draw from the King Arthur story and legend and whatnot. But if you look at Game of Thrones, I think probably has one of the most medieval feels to it because when people get stabbed, they die. And there's always this conscious...
And they die from infection.
Yeah, worry of sickness.
And
yeah, and like people die
lack
hard.
of food.
Yeah, like there are very real concerns of the real, like the mundane world and throughout all of those stories. And it adds a certain amount of, it grounds it, I guess, in a way. Black Death is another great movie if you want to see something that's a great example of a real strong medieval feel. It takes place during the Black Plague. It's got Sean Bean, which means he has to die in every movie, sort of like Leonardo DiCaprio. And
there's good versus evil. There's a quest. There's magic. There's medievalism.
And what's interesting about it is that you're not really sure if the magic is real, which is kind of a cool thing to play on, to not know whether it's legit or not.
Is the magic real, or is my water just coming in lead pipes?
Right.
Who knows?
The power of suggestion. And then if you want some more mundane things, there's always Kingdom of Heaven or Braveheart. There's lots of different medieval movies to go watch if you want something that is just pure medieval, to sort of find some inspiration to draw more of that into your fantasy gaming. But it is a very strong piece of that, and I think one of the things that's a delicate rope to walk, I guess, depends on your style of game, is the level of grimness. So you have Game of Thrones and Warhammer Fantasy, right? Very grim. And then at the other end, you have sort of like Forgotten Realms, I mentioned, where there's clerics on every corner that can bring anybody back from the dead, and then everything in between there.
And then there's Neverending Story.
Yeah, they don't bring the horse back.
So very grim.
Atreyu. Are there any other broad stroke tropes that you want to mention real quick?
I think we hit the major ones.
Right on. I agree. There's a lot of other things that we involve in our table, but those are the sort of the main...
Not just on our table, those are the main tropes in the fantasy genre.
Yeah. But those are the ones that we sort of focus on to sort of keep it grounded in a fantasy world, right? So in terms of things that have pushed us away from fantasy gaming, what would you say is your number one thing that has pushed you away from it?
Lack of risk. Everybody wants to make a character and have that character make it to epic level and never die. And why does it even matter if I roll the dice if there is no chance whatsoever that my character is going to die? There's no reason. Why don't we just sit around a circle and tell a story? Like we're playing a game. Like I want risk.
Well, because I feel like if there's no risk, then the reward isn't very sweet.
Yeah. Well, like I don't feel like I've overcome any kind of challenge if there was never really a challenge.
Right.
So that's my number one.
Well, and this isn't to dig at different systems or anything. That's not our goal, because I like different pieces of D&D and Pathfinder and that kind of stuff. And I like different pieces of OSR games like BX and LOTFP, right? But one of the things that really pushed me away, you mentioned, no risk, is that in so much of the D&D stuff, all of the encounters are geared to be balanced. So if you have 4 5th level characters, these are how many orcs I need to put in there for it to be balanced. And I realize you can run that game any way you want, and I will totally concede that. But that's sort of built into the mechanics of it. When they put those things in there, it's a way to tell you this should be challenging encounter, this should be a not challenging encounter, and however you want to divvy up experience and whatever. And I think that sort of takes a certain amount of... It makes the combat sport instead of war. And I feel like it's almost like playing a football game instead of like actually having real combat, right? My biggest one is fantasy getting boring. So much of the stuff that had come out for a long time that pushed me away from fantasy gaming, it was just a rehashing of the same things, and they weren't fun anymore. There wasn't enough of a change or twist to things to where it felt like something new. To be fair, I never was really a big fan of buying pre-made adventures anyway. I just didn't do that. So we always sort of made our own stuff up at the table, but even the stuff that I was doing that would initially sort of suited our table, right? Because it's easy to make something for your table because the people there, but the stuff that they're producing, they sort of have to make it for, a larger audience, so it may not quite work for your table. But all of it just sort of got tired and boring to me, and sort of was like, well, there's a lot more exciting stuff in Vampire or anything, really, and it sort of just drove me away from it. And that has since then gone away, but that's initially the biggest thing that pushed me away from it, is just being bored of it and not being inspired anymore.
I think a lot of that for me has to do with the incentive for character development. And I know that 5th edition added some stuff, but honestly, like Dungeons and Dragons lost me before 5th edition ever came out, so I have no incentive to pick it back up.
I think they've done good things to try and turn the ship.
Yeah.
But it takes a long
Pathfinder,
time.
I guess, is about like what everybody says is like 3.5 or something like that. Or if you played
Now,
3rd edition, you played
I haven't done the second
Again.
edition playtest, but they say it's closer. It's closer to 5th than it is to. It's somewhere in between. So they're doing something as well, but still, I'm not. There's just too much there.
Yeah. Well, and I guess really like even with LOTFP, there's not inherently a large amount of character development in making
No.
those character sheets either. So I think, but they make up for it in just interesting setting material and well thought out adventures or
Right.
something.
Well, and then another big piece
And
of it
creatures
was
and things like they make up for it in all the other ways, basically.
another big piece that pushed me away was the amount of crunch that existed in a game. Is I think just as my gaming went along, I didn't want to learn big systems. I learned a ton of big systems as time has gone by.
I'm still there for any kind of gaming. Doesn't matter if it's fantasy or whatever. Most
Yeah.
of the time, I'm just like, is there more than one book? No, I'm good.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
just I can't.
I'll catch you on the next one.
don't have the time or the desire. It's not even. I guess it's not even time because I read a ton of different RPG books and regular books. I just don't have the desire to do it anymore. I don't want to sift through all of that stuff and have to spend all that time trying to prepare this stuff. But also, if I'm going to run a game, I don't want to sort of impose that on my players as well because they have just as little time as I do. And if I say we're going to play 3rd edition and you've never played it, well, then you sort of have to learn to navigate all of that stuff as well. And I just am not interested in that quite as much anymore. So even though things have started to move in the D&D Pathfinder world towards a more streamlined game, I'm not sure it's still there for me. So that's why
Well, even if things are simpler now for the players playing the game, there's still a ton of work as a dungeon master that you have to put in and rules that you have to know. Like it may be easier for them, but it's still a lot easier for you.
Right. That's
so
true. That's a fair point.
I'm just kind of lazy. Like I don't want to work that hard for it.
And speaking of the amount of work, another thing is the way books are put together. When you have these giant books and there's so much there, and it's not easy to sort through and find them. Maze of the Blue Medusa is one of the most amazing books because it's big and there's a lot of information there. But the way it is laid out is so well put together to be able to find things and navigate it easy. Short descriptions here, big descriptions back here. It's just incredibly well put together. It's a book that's put together for someone to use it, not sort of read it and then be able to sort of retain all of that and then run it that way. It's designed so that you can be in the moment referencing things and flipping back and forth, and it's just more practical, I suppose.
It's weird going from like one system to another sometimes because Dungeons and Dragons has a rule for everything. And then you pick up like this slender Lamentations of the Flame Princess core rule book, right? And you're like, And then so maybe something comes up in the game and you're like, what should I do for this? And then you're like, I don't know, let me consult the book. It
Right.
doesn't say. I guess I get to make it up. Like, why was that not the solution in the first place?
And then I know we're going to talk about LOTFP a lot here, but when we mention that, it's more than just LOTFP. It's the entire OSR movement in a lot of ways. So like things like Hot Springs, that is sort of in that same wheelhouse. BX is in that same wheelhouse. So I know we're gonna talk about LOTFP a lot here, but it includes a lot of that sort of OSR mentality about how you sort of put things together.
Yeah, sometimes less is more.
I agree.
I feel like we got off the fantasy thing. Now we're talking about systems. So sorry about that. I didn't mean to get off on a tangent.
Derail, right.
Trying not to mention D&D specifically and things I don't like because, I don't know, whatever.
Well, and it's not to dig at D&D because it's a great game. It's what gets most people into gaming.
Yeah, and I don't want to do this to say don't play D&D. I want to do this to say if you want to play D&D, make it better by doing these things. Or if you want to play LOTFP, sweet, do it. Make it better by doing these things. Just like in general, in fantasy gaming.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's one of my favorite things
better.
about the Lamentations and any of the OSR books. There are a lot of great adventures and worlds and settings they have put out there. And they very easily, because they don't have... You can take that book and put it in a Pathfinder game. You can take that book and put it almost directly into a 5th edition game. And it wouldn't be as easy to take a 5th edition game or setting and move that directly into like a Pathfinder game because those are further apart. But since the source is all original D&D and OSR stuff, you can sort of take those great adventures and worlds and move them into either way and they work just fine. Very little transition. So
I think one of the last things is just boring linear progression of story.
part of it I understand is if you have things like Adventurers League or Pathfinder Society, I get it. You sort of need to have a linear progression of adventures so that you can have the players come in and stay consistent on story from one adventure to the next. So for that, I'm totally willing to concede it, because that is some people, that's the only way they play. And the adventures don't work moving from one character from another game master to another gaming group if they don't sort of progress that way. So I sort of, that's a mulligan for me. You know, like it makes sense that way. I'm not going to say it's what I want to do.
I get it. But to me, I don't see a difference between doing that and playing Descent and just occasionally, like, you know, narrating what you're doing with your miniature. Like, if we're starting in the same place, ending in the same place, taking the same path and keeping track of our advancements, like, I really honestly don't see a difference. Like, that's not, I don't know.
Hang on a minute.
I want to crap on everybody's fun.
Hang on a minute. Let me think.
I mean, there's a story, there's box text, you have a character. Like, is it because the character sheet's already printed and you filled in dots when you made yours that makes it different?
I don't know that I have a good argument against your comparison, but I will say that there is definitely more characterization in a D&D or Pathfinder Society game, I'm sure, than there are in Descent. But I agree, the parallel that you're drawing is painfully close in some ways. But I think it just depends on what you want to get out of the game.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's a fair point what you say, but if that's what you want, then there's nothing wrong with that. Because
tons of people like to play Descent.
Right. Well, my thing is that I don't want to play linear adventures in that kind of way. That's not the experience that I'm looking for. I want something a little more broad and a little more open-ended than that, which I think most people that aren't playing exclusively in that's probably what they want. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Along with the linear adventures is that sort of boring box text style of thing. And I mentioned pre-published adventures before. It's just not my thing. It's just not what I'm really want to go after and be interested in. So
I think it would depend on the adventure. Like, if it was well done.
Oh, yeah.
You know, if it was like Blood in the Chocolate, like, I'd play that five times in a row and not be sad about it.
But those are put together.
But that's not a linear progression adventure.
Right,
that's,
exactly.
Here's the thing that's happening. Now go explore the world that I've created for you.
Right. It's like Red and Pleasant Land is a pretty big world, right? Blood in the Chocolate is still, it's just a smaller scale. There's still as many moving pieces and parts and non-linear and choices to make that could change things.
It's a very well-developed setting.
Right.
With a well-developed NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
It's not you're going to do this kind of exact thing.
Right.
And the quest is presented in the form of chocolate. So we've kind of talked a lot about what we don't like in this episode, which was kind of purposeful, and just in general what, you know, the breakdown of the fantasy genre is and the tropes. So what we're looking forward to doing in the upcoming episodes is breaking down those topics into smaller chunks and making actual solid suggestions on tweaks that you can do at your gaming table to make your fantasy games better. So we thought the best way to do that would be to break it apart so you're not getting like one big 2-hour episode. So
I don't even know that would be enough time for some of these things.
Yeah, so we're just breaking it up into topics for you. So the general topics that you can look forward to coming up are magic. We're going to do more of a deep dive on that topic individually in a fantasy setting. And then creatures and characters, both PCs and NPCs, and then the actual setting and world itself. And somewhere along there in the journey, we're going to talk about, you know, system and how to change things around to make it better. But that's the general layout that's coming up.
So it's probably worth mentioning that we're going to reference a fair amount of movies and stories throughout this. So most of the things that I think that we're probably going to mention have been out there long enough to where it's not really a spoiler so much anymore. But there are some things that you may not have seen yet because some of them are smaller films or whatever. So Black Death is the first one to mention, and I mentioned it already. It's got Sean Bean in it. It's a great movie. It's kind of dark. It's about the Black Plague and these sort of crusaders and flagellants going around trying to end the plague and stop things, right?
It sounded like you just said flatulence.
Flatulence, no, flagellants. I'm sorry. And another one is Pan's Labyrinth.
That's a really good movie.
Yeah. So if you haven't seen, it's a Guillermo del Toro movie, and it is amazing and definitely tons and loads of inspiration in that one. So check that one out. That's a really good one as well. Although it does take place in the Spanish Civil War, so it's not.
Fairy tales are a little different though, because they're not really like a quest. They're like a moral
parable or something.
Yeah.
But she definitely does go into a fantastical world, and that's really more of where the inspiration for all this is going to come from. Obviously, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter. I think everybody's probably already very vaguely familiar with those. Anything else on the list there?
There are tons of things on the list, but I feel like pretty much everybody should have seen all of these things by now, honestly.
Let me take a look.
Stardust.
Oh, yeah.
Alice in Wonderland. I don't want to say Conan, so.
Conan. The Labyrinth is an older movie that most people may not have seen. Also, Willow. Willow is an older movie from the 80s.
I already mentioned The Neverending Story, so yeah.
Princess Bride. Dragonheart, Chronicles of Narnia. Yeah.
There's a few at the bottom, too. Some of them are already stories, too, like The Princess Bride and Harry Potter and Game of Thrones. Those are all, I hope you all know that they're books to start with and then movies. But I put 1602 on there because I really liked that. And I know it's like superheroes, which is different, but it's set in the medieval setting and there's magic and it's kind of questy.
Oh, I think I mentioned The 13th Warrior before. That's worth a watch. It's a good one.
And then Mouse Guard. Mm-hmm. I wrote Sandman, but it's kind of a different thing because it's not medieval really, because it's kind of about, it's more mythological really, because it's about like, Morpheus, who's the god. So yeah, it's back and forth, but.
Right on. Well, a lot to we wanted to basically just put together some broad strokes to give you guys some idea of where we're going to head with this sort of series that we're going to do. And hopefully it will give you some context for where we're going to go with this and kind of build a frame around what we're going to do, so we don't sort of run haywire and spend a lot of time talking about nothing. Because our goal is to give practical tools to use to actually affect something at your table. Anything else?
No, don't think so.
We are a member of the Gun and Geek Network, so a quick Gun and Geek promo for the Intellectual Podcast, episode 225, Mark Christopher Lawrence. Mark Christopher Lawrence, Chuck, chats with Dave and Whitney about his 4-decade career as an actor and comedian, from his days growing up in Compton to his time as Big Mike on the hit TV series Chuck. Mark is honest, funny, and very insightful in his views on succeeding in the business, and it's a conversation you won't want to miss. So that is the Intellectual Podcast, episode 225, Mark Christopher Lawrence, and you can check them out on the Gun and Geek Network. As always, thank you guys for hanging out with us, and you can support us if you run over to Patreon. We're at patreon.com/justonemorefix. You can support us there, get access to all of our pre-shows and raw episodes, and as soon as our actual plays are done, they go up right away because normally they don't follow the release schedule on the Patreon. And also, we will be releasing our Weird on the Waves actual play on there before, so that any Patreon supporters can get access to that right away, because that one sort of is hanging in the wings waiting for a release date. I think that'll do it for us, and as always, we will see you guys next week. Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can support us at patreon.com/justonemorefix, or follow us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix.